Thanks so much, Morgan, and thank all of you for joining me. This was a lot of work, and I'm really excited that it's going to be able to reach people who are interested in this information. And Dietrich, you're going to be controlling my slides, so if you could start, that would be wonderful. While we're waiting for the slides, this is to, as Morgan said, to provide information, but also to help people find the information themselves. Next slide, please. I really want to give a huge thank you to the staff of ITPC and other consultants, particularly the Make Medicines Affordable partners and staff and consultants, and Dr. Andrew Hill. So many of you contributed to this resource, and I'm very grateful for your help. Next slide, please. So I may skip the first couple slides because Morgan has pretty much covered it, but just, I'm going to give a brief general overview of the resource and then go through some of the sections with time for a Q&A afterwards. Next slide, please, Dietrich. So mainly the resource was made for activists who are working on affordability of and access to HIV prevention and treatment in low and middle income countries, although it may be a resource for others as well. And it includes perspectives from Make Medicines Affordable partners, an overview of how HIV drug development works, and what we know about drugs and at what stage we know it, some information on patent barriers and how and when they can be challenged, pipeline and recently approved ARV updates. And in short, I like to think about it as what to fight for, why to fight for it, and how to fight for it. Next slide, please. So this is really for a clinical perspective to prioritize HIV drugs for access interventions. There are lots of legal and strategic reasons that this really doesn't cover. I'm not an expert in those things. There are lots of experts I know on this webinar and others that I have the great privilege to work with. But this is really very clinically focused. And it's really to help people understand clinical trials and the information that's available after each phase of development, and also sort of how to interpret it, how to look beyond the data and at things that really matter, to help make decisions and just give you a fuller picture of where a new ARV combination or strategy would fit. And it has a lot of stuff that can be used for background information for white papers, briefs, and any other policy documents on access to medicines. Oh, and I apologize, I'm talking too fast. Sorry, translators. I'm going to go a little slower. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to cover is the process of HIV drug development. Next slide, please. So HIV was discovered in 1983. And now we have more than 30 different antiretrovirals from 8 different classes that target the virus at different points in its life cycle that are approved. And over the years, the safety, tolerability, effectiveness, and convenience of HIV treatment have all improved dramatically. And we have a really amazing track record. Since the first ARV was approved in 1987, there's only been one drug, Defivir, which was not FDA approved because at the dose needed for HIV, it caused kidney toxicity. Gilead later marketed it for hepatitis B, although it was replaced by tenofovir, which was more effective. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, thank you. So can you hit the button once more? I forgot about my little animation here. So some people on this call may remember the early days when people had to take 3 or more drugs 3 times daily with food. I literally remember people who had beepers and alarms that would go off, and it really ruled their lives in a way, not only because of the dosing in the food, but because the side effects of the earlier drugs were harsher than the drugs we have now. And we've gone from that to some single tablet regimens once daily without food. Doesn't mean there's no more room for improvement, but it's pretty amazing that things have gone this far and are going further with long-acting formulations and other innovations, which I will discuss later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So many of us have heard pharma talk about how much they spend on drug development, and there have been all sorts of different estimates. Some of them have been in the billions. So what they're referring to is running at least the first 3 phases of the trials, possibly phase 4 trials, but those are often for marketing purposes. So they get a lot from doing that. In 2018, an estimate which has not been adjusted for inflation, but it said the cost to bring a drug to market, including failed trials, was 983 million per product. So I think when we're looking at access arguments, it's really interesting to see what kind of revenues have been generated. And when you hear pharma go on about the cost of innovation, how everyone has to pitch in, just know they're making so much money and they're not transparent and they refuse to be, but more and more, we have a pretty good idea of what it truly costs. And I'm going to go through all the trials listed in this slide one by one. Next slide, please. So preclinical trials are done in laboratories and in animals. So companies have a library with hundreds to multiple thousands and thousands of chemical compounds. And they screen them to see if they have activity against certain viruses, in this case, HIV. So once it's determined that they do have activity against HIV, there are some screenings that are done on the compound to see how toxic they might be, how effective they might be. And sometimes they tinker with the drug, a process that's called lead optimization. And once they feel that it's ready, they will bring it into human studies. But often you'll see a poster with some information about a preclinical compound. Pharma will highlight things like saying it's this potent, it has a really high resistance barrier, but we really need to see this in people. So, you can put a lot of things into a preclinical trial that will look good, that don't get the job done in the complex environment of a person's body. So let's just assume that our imaginary HIV drug looks really good in clinical trials and the sponsor, greedy pharmaceutical company, is ready to bring it forward. Next slide, please. The next stage would be a phase 1 trial. And these are the first in human trials. And they're short. They last from weeks to months, and they're small, usually less than 100 people. In HIV, they begin in healthy volunteers. Sometimes they will move into people with HIV in this stage if things look good in healthy volunteers. And the drug is usually given in a single dose, sometimes in multiple doses that go higher because they're really trying to get the idea of the maximum tolerated and most effective dose for a drug. These studies look at a drug's safety above all, including the potential to cause short or long-term harm, potential reproductive toxicity, although that's in animals more than in people. They don't.
Раз. Я прийшла, звісно, прийшла. Я не знаю вже, як я встигаю займатися чи ні. Просто, що я третій раз уже переношу, бо це не тиждень.
Sorry, do I need to slow down more?
No, I think it's fine.
Okay, thanks. So the reprotox studies are done in animals. They also look at the side effects that study volunteers have at different doses, how the drug passes through the body, and whether it does anything, like does it reduce the viral load? These trials are not going to provide the full picture of clinical information that is really needed to prioritize access. But there may be other strategic reasons to pursue access strategies for a product in phase 1, and I'll talk about those a little later on. So I couldn't find a precise estimate for HIV drugs, but overall, about a quarter of all the drugs developed for infectious diseases in phase 1 are approved, ultimately approved. And that's one of the higher rates. A lot of drugs fail in phase 1. So let's say Greedy Pharma's phase 1 drug looks great and it's ready to move forward. Next slide, please. Phase 2 drug trials are larger, over 100 people in different sites and countries, but they remain fairly restrictive. They want people with milder stages of an illness who don't have any comorbidities or have very mild controlled comorbidities. They look at the safety and tolerability and efficacy. They look at dosing, they look at drug interactions, and sometimes they explore treatment strategies. And usually they pinpoint the dose of the drug. You should really know this by the end of phase 2. And phase 2 is really the make it or break it stage. And it's a good time to get an idea about whether a drug looks really good or not. If you're used to looking at drugs and you know the condition, it's fairly easy to tell. For example, when the hepatitis C drug sofosbuvir came out, what happened in the phase 2 trials was amazing, and it made it very clear that this was a good drug and one to pursue. So overall, about 35% of infectious disease drugs in phase 2 make it to approval. So you can see that has increased the likelihood by about 10% once the drug makes it to phase 2. And drugs that look good in phase 2 will go on to phase 3. Next slide, please. These trials enroll hundreds to thousands of people at multiple sites and countries. For HIV trials, they last for at least a year, often for a few years, which is good because you're looking at drugs that people will be taking for years and years. They're usually randomized, which means that people are assigned at random to a treatment group and they're controlled. So that means the experimental drug or regimen is compared to the standard of care. It has to be at least as good or better to be approved. These trials continue to look at safety, they look at side effects, and they look at efficacy. And they're more inclusive than earlier phase trials. They enroll sicker people, more diversity in terms of comorbidity, hopefully, but not always in terms of geography, race, ethnicity, etc. They're also called registration trials because they're the step, the last trial before things are submitted for regulatory approval. And 3/4 of all infectious disease drugs that make it to phase 3 are approved, which is also a pretty high percentage. We in HIV are just not used to a lot of failure rates for, phase 3 drugs because we don't really have that many. Next slide, please. So phase 4 trials are called post-marketing trials. And sometimes they're done because a regulatory agency requires it. For example, pediatric trials are done usually in phase 4 because it's completely different formulation and maybe different for different weight bands or ages of children. And sometimes these regulatory requirements turn into something pharma uses a lot for marketing. So sometimes they're both. They can look at different strategies, populations, and then if the sponsor is not a pharmaceutical company, for example, a government-funded research network, they sometimes do head-to-head trials. But you don't really see head-to-head pharma trials because they don't want their products to look less effective or less desirable than a competitor's product. Next slide, please. So that leads me, maybe not so naturally, but to generic antiretrovirals. Next slide, please. So the resource has a table of all USA FDA approved and World Health Organization pre-qualified antiretrovirals in chronological order. The reason why these two regulatory authorities were picked, honestly, is because they have the best available online information. Many national regulatory agencies don't provide the same level of information, such as the date, the process, the companies that produce generic versions, etc. But this was only done to get the most comprehensive information, not because any of us believe that other regulatory agencies are unimportant. And the table is really important because it shows you the lag between when high income country ARVs are registered and when generic ARVs become accessible in a lot of countries. And one example, AZT, the first approved antiretroviral in 1987, was not available as a WHO pre-qualified generic version until 2000, 13 years later. And in this table, you will see all the currently approved drugs. You'll also see things that generics producers were able to do that pharma can't, such as fixed dose combinations of certain drugs that are just not always available in high income countries in branded versions. Next slide, please. So the resource does include some information about things that people living with HIV and their allies can do to support the role of patent offices and to overcome other patent barriers, although Make Medicines Affordable has many other much more comprehensive resources available at the website that cover this information. So gathering legal and scientific evidence to oppose unmerited or unlawful patents before they can be granted, which is a pre-grant opposition, or also called a third-party observation. This can be done before patents granted. If it's not possible to do this before a patent is granted, you can initiate a post-grant opposition to revoke a granted patent. And this resource may contain some of that scientific information to help you. Next slide, please. So medically speaking, the more that's known about a drug, the better. So you'd want to wait to learn as much as you could before taking any kind of access intervention. But from an access perspective, it may be better to start interventions as early as possible before drugs are approved. And there's a little table on the next two slides that gives some pros and cons to early versus late. Next slide, please. So doing things sooner in phase 1 when you first hear about a drug. For example, if it's a drug from a brand new class, means that it's possible.
Sorry, Tracy.
That's okay, thanks. It means that pre-grant opposition is possible. And this is maybe the best time to focus on new drugs and the technologies behind them. But the problem, the cons are the drug or technology might not work. Although it still may be useful to file a pre-grant opposition, and the benefit might not be, for this work, might not be immediate. Next slide, please. Okay, waiting longer, you know more about the product benefits. There's less risk that you're going to waste time, resources, etc., on products that aren't suitable or were never approved and don't become available. The immediates are the benefits are more immediate. And compulsory licenses are for finished products are usually granted after products are approved, etc. And a lot of this is in the resource, so I don't want to read the entire slide to you since you have the link, and if you're interested, you can take a look. But really, we just wanted to give people a sense of there's not a perfect time, and it really depends on a lot of factors. Next slide, please. Okay, I'd like to talk about something called a target product profile and prioritizing antiretrovirals for access interventions. Next slide, please. So a target product profile is really just a list of the preferred and desirable characteristics for an ARV. Just to give you an example, clearly affordable, safe, tolerable, effective, potent with a high resistance barrier, possibly drugs from a brand new class because they could be used in first, second, and third line treatment, and maybe even for prevention, which might enable bulk procurement and economies of scale. And universal, something that we know will work in all ages and populations during pregnancy, breastfeeding, and safe for people with comorbidities. Ideally, something that can be easily and inexpensively produced. And when this list was made, I wasn't thinking of Cab-LA, so I should probably add rapidly produced to it. Something that's convenient, once daily, can be formulated into a fixed dose combination, has no food requirements, or if it's possible, put into a long-acting formulation, temperature stable, that's not likely to interact with commonly used medicines, including for really common co-infections and opportunistic infections, things like methadone, hormonal contraception, etc. And something that can be dose adjusted instead of just saying you can't use these drugs together. For example, there are a lot of HIV antiretrovirals that can't be used with the TB medicine rifampicin. And it would be desirable to avoid that. And activists can make their own TPPs and use it to prioritize ARVs for access interventions. And it's also really useful when engaging with local communities, governments, pharmaceutical companies, the World Health Organization. And WHO has their own target product profiles as well. But I think sometimes some of the drugs I see that have come out, for example, the long-acting combination of cabotegravir and ripivirine, does not fit many of the things on this list. So it really isn't something that, is a great, one reason why WHO does not recommend it. And I'll be discussing that in more detail later in this presentation as well. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd put some considerations in for long-acting antiretrovirals. The first is does not require a cold chain. That means a drug can be shipped and stored without having to be temperature controlled. And again, the low likelihood of interactions with rifampicin, hormonal contraception, gender-affirming hormones, opioid substitution treatment, and other medicines. And also that it's easy to deliver within a public health framework, that the dosing is and scheduling are convenient for people and their healthcare systems and doesn't really create a big additional burden to either. And a clear understanding of something called the tail phase that I'm going to explain to you right now. Next slide, please. So what is a pharmacokinetic or PK tail? And pharmacokinetic is a word for how drugs move through the body. So the tail is actually how long the active ingredient of a drug stays active in a person's body. And one example is long-acting cabotegravir. It has a very, very long tail. It can remain in someone's body at low levels for months to years. And these levels are too low to prevent HIV. So people who are at risk for HIV and miss a dose of or stop taking long-acting cabotegravir will need oral PrEP or another means of HIV prevention because there's not enough of the drug left in their system to protect them from HIV. The other thing that can happen is if someone is unable to access another form of HIV prevention and they get HIV, having that low level of the drug, which can't fight off HIV, may cause the virus to become resistant to it. So a long tail is not a great thing for some of these medicines. We really need to understand how long the tail is and what people need to do. And I have some sort of precise examples from trials of long-acting cabotegravir. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is how long the tail stays in people's bodies at 12 weeks after the last shot, 24, 36, 48, 60, and 78 weeks by sex at birth. And where you see the green bar, that's where people still have enough. Okay, so what you can really see is 12 weeks is too long. People need it every 2 months. But by 78 weeks, there's still a group of people that have certain levels of CAB-LA left in their bloodstream that are not enough to be effective. That's a bar in any one of those boxes that is not green. Next slide, please. This research went on to week 76. And you can see it tends to stay in people's bodies for a long, long, long time at low levels. What studies have found is that people have a high body mass index and women are more likely to have a longer PK tail with CAB-LA. So this is something it's really important to look into with long-acting prevention. And with long-acting treatment, it's a little different because if people switch off, they would probably start an oral treatment right away. And there are you can do something called bridging. If you miss a dose of long-acting cabotegravir with oral medicine, if you're late till the next dose, but you really want to avoid just having this tail low level of one medicine in your body that won't protect people from HIV. Next slide, please. So that was just one super nerdy example of clinical criteria that to think about. And I often will bring this up or think about it or present the information. It's not the kind of thing that most people are really going to spend a lot of time looking into. So clinical criteria for selecting ARVs for access interventions. Is the ARV included in the WHO guidelines? If it isn't, it might be because it's not approved or WHO is going through the process. So there are other ARVs that are worth selecting or prioritizing for an access intervention, but that's just one. What about an unmet need? A drug from a brand new class that's really good for a certain population or is very effective for a certain disease stage. Or, for example, drugs that are very effective for people who have multi-drug resistant HIV and very few treatment options. Drugs that are just better. They're more effective. They have fewer side effects than existing options. Drugs that have a formulation advantage, cheaper to produce. They're easy to put in fixed dose combinations or to make into long-acting formulations. And the public health benefit. So these are all things to think about from a clinical standpoint. And if I do presentations rating a drug, these are all the things that I consider. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of other considerations, such as, community priorities and national data. For PrEP, how about HIV incidence? Does your country have a high rate of new infections? And is there access to PrEP already? What options are available? How much coverage is there? Treatment coverage. Does it need to be expanded? What are the most common opportunistic infections or comorbidities? And such as different forms of tuberculosis, what drugs might be needed to treat these or prevent them? What's the current need for second and third line treatment in your country? How many people have had first or second line treatment failure? Are there enough options and is there enough coverage of second and third line treatment? Do people need new options? And what's the current status of the healthcare system? Is it ready to, say, implement long-acting antiretrovirals? For example, CAB-LA and long-acting treatment are shots given in the buttocks. Lenacapavir is given in the abdomen. This requires clinics to have a private space where people get these shots. Does your healthcare system need more resources? And is it strategic to co-advocate for both access to more newer products, as well as the resources your healthcare system will need to deliver them? Next slide, please. So the next phase, which is also covered in the resource, are sections on pipeline and recently approved antiretrovirals. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk mostly about lenacapavir for prevention and treatment because it's been in the news lately. A little bit about islatravir and barely at all about products in earlier stages. They're included in the resource. So next slide, please. Lenacapavir is a capsid inhibitor. It interrupts multiple stages of HIV life cycle. And it's approved in high-income countries as part of treatment for people with multi-drug resistant HIV who have very few treatment options. That is the only way it has been approved so far. It is given as a weekly or daily tablet, usually as a lead-in before 2 injections in the abdomen, which are given every 6 months. So it's long-acting. So it is being studied as part of a once-weekly oral regimen with islatravir. And as part of first-line treatment and part of HIV treatment in people who are already virally suppressed. But it needs a partner drug with the same dosing schedule. Okay, because nobody's going to get that excited about a drug they get as an injection every 6 months if they still have to take pills every day. So Len is kind of waiting for a partner. The closest thing is this once weekly pill trial. And the results from these treatment trials are expected between 2024 and 2027. The resource describes these trials in great detail, the number of participants, the regimens, the countries where they're being conducted, etc. Next slide, please. One thing we have learned is that the injections can be painful and they may leave nodules, which are small, hard bumps under the abdomen that can last for months. And I think it's really important for us to look at adverse events and discontinuation rates from ongoing treatment and prevention trials to see, are people having problems with this? Are there better ways to manage it, to make the injections less painful, to address the nodules or other side effects that people are having? In fact, at any trial I look at, I always look at the discontinuation rates. That tells me so much, not just what percentage, but why, and how many of them were treatment related. A treatment can sound great, but if you notice there was kind of a high dropout rate for side effects, really makes you think, well, these are people who are really motivated. In a trial, in the real world, people may be less motivated or less willing to put up with certain side effects. So it's always a good idea to look at that. Next slide, please. So there are a bunch of different PrEP trials with lenacapavir. Adolescent girls and young women in South Africa and Uganda, Purpose 1. These results were just released and I'll discuss them. For cisgender men, transgender women and men, and gender non-binary people who have sex with partners assigned male at birth. That study is underway in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Peru, South Africa, and the US. It's called Purpose 2. Purpose 3 is for cisgender adult women in the US. Purpose 4 for people who inject drugs in the US. I just want to say this is especially important because we really don't have good prevention data for people who inject drugs. There are planned or underway studies with long-acting cabotegravir, but there's no data yet. And their data on oral PrEP for people who inject drugs is not great. So that's really super important information. And there's one more trial, Purpose 5, taking France and the UK for people, and this was Gilead's words, who are disproportionately affected by HIV, may not be represented in clinical trials and are not using PrEP. So I'm wondering how they're going to find these people if they're not represented in clinical trials, not using PrEP. But, we'll see as more information about Purpose 5 comes out. Next slide, please. I think you have to hit the forward key. Yes, this is an animated slide. Okay, this is the Purpose 1 data that you may have heard about. There were 3 groups in this trial. And Dietrich, you can go ahead and advance 2 more. Please. Thank you. So the first group got lenacapavir. They got a placebo for oral PrEP. Everyone in the trial got something, but people didn't know whether they actually got oral PrEP or lenacapavir. The second group got oral PrEP with tenofovir alafenamide and FDC and placebo lenacapavir. The third group got oral daily tenofovir FTC and placebo lenacapavir. Okay, so those are the 3 treatment groups in the trial. And you notice that there are more people in group 1 and group 2 than there are in group 3. But this basically compared lenacapavir to either oral PrEP with TAF, FTC, or oral PrEP with tenofovir, FTC. Next, advance, please, Diedrich. So this went on for at least a year, for up to a maximum of 3 years. Next, please. So then the idea originally was that everyone in the trial would be unblinded. They would know which prevention method they'd gotten, and they would be offered a year of lenacapavir. After that, there would be something called a PK tail phase. You remember I was just mentioning the tail that lasts for up to 78 weeks. And I think, you know, this is something I have questions about, like why so long? We don't know that yet. But anyway, that was the original design of the trial. But an interim analysis was done, which changed everything. Next slide, please. You can advance it. And you can advance it again, please. And once more, please. So what happened was in group 1, the people who got lenacapavir, there were no new HIV infections out of 2,134 adolescent girls and young women. In group 2, who got oral daily PrEP with TAF and FTC, there were 39 new HIV infections out of 2,136 adolescent girls and young women. And in group 3, who got oral daily tenofovir FTC, there were 16 new HIV infections among 1,068 adolescent girls and young women. So based on these results, the trial's independent data monitoring committee recommended that Gilead stop the blinded phase of the trial and offer everyone open label lenacapavir because it was significantly more effective. Next slide, please. So we don't know a lot of things yet because the only data we have about Purpose 1 was from a press release that Gilead sent out. And these will tell us the things that the company wants us to know, but it doesn't tell us all the things that we might want to know. First of all, how did they analyze the data? Did they count everyone that was in each treatment arm, or did they only count the people that stayed in the treatment arm? Okay, if you count everybody, including the people who dropped out or never got the drug for some reason or weren't adherent, that's called an intent to treat analysis. And that tells you how well something worked for people who used it the way that it was intended to be used and didn't use it the way it was intended to be used. It tells you about everybody. But a per protocol analysis only gives you the information from people who followed the trial perfectly. People who started, who didn't miss their doses, who didn't drop out. So intent to treat things can make things look a little less effective, while per protocol analysis can make it look more effective. And what you really want is to see both, so you get a full picture of the data. And we don't know which type of analysis was used in the press release. Next slide, please. We also don't know what testing strategy was used in the trial. We don't know how often people were tested. We don't know what triggered them to be tested. We don't know yet how many pregnancies there were during the trial and in each group and what the outcomes were. We don't know if the trial measured drug levels in some participants. And we don't know how well oral PrEP worked for people who are highly adherent to it. We have how well it worked for everyone in the group that got it, but not in the people who are able to take it as prescribed. We don't know how many people got their dose of lenacapavir late or how late. We don't know what the adverse events were. We don't know if they were treatment related. We don't know how many people reported having nodules. We don't know how many people reported injection site reactions like pain or swelling and how serious those were. Most importantly, we don't know how many people discontinued the treatment because of adverse events. And we don't yet know how long Len's PK tail is. Next slide, please. So there will be more information presented at the World AIDS Conference on July 24th at 10:30 a.m. Central European Time. For those of you who are going in person, Hall C1. For those of you who are attending virtually, Channel 1. For those of you who aren't attending, people will be sharing the information pretty much very, very soon afterwards, as usually happens. And often there's a peer-reviewed journal article that comes out at the same time as when the data are first presented, and that provides a lot more information than the presentation. So hopefully that will happen with this. I'm assuming that it will, but I don't know for sure. Next slide, please. Another drug in development is called islatravir. It's a once daily or once weekly antiretroviral that interrupts HIV reproduction in 2 different places. And it looked great, but its development was halted temporarily because at the dose it was being studied at, it decreased white blood cells, including CD4 cell count. A lower dose is now being studied, and so far it seems safe and effective. It was originally going to be a long-acting drug, but because of this side effect, it's now only given orally, once daily or once weekly in clinical trials. Next slide, please. It's currently in phase 3. As I said, the development was interrupted when it became clear that it dropped the CD4 count. So far, so good. And this drug has a lot of potential, but it's not really clear how useful, especially a once weekly oral ARV will be. A once daily one may be really helpful, but we'll see what comes in with long acting. And it could have been a really great 3rd-line drug, but the new dose might be too low to be effective for people that have a lot of drug resistance. So it's not being studied in that population. Next slide, please. So this is what the once weekly oral lenacapavir and islatravir trial looks like. It's being studied in 106 people living with HIV who are already virally suppressed. They will either stay on their once daily ARVs or switch to once weekly treatment. The results are not available yet. Next slide, please. There are week 24 results that looked at CD4 cell count. Viral suppression was identical in both groups, the people who stayed on the drugs they were taking and the people who switched to a once weekly oral regimen. CD4 counts were good. Dry mouth and nausea were the most common side effects among people who got lenacapavir and islatravir, but nobody stopped treatment because of them. So there will be more data coming on this regimen. Next slide, please. And what's coming next? There's a weekly oral integrase inhibitor. And MK8257 that's in the same class as islatravir. It's an oral drug, which people might be able to take once a month. So there is progress in long-acting and longer-acting formulations, but these are both very early-stage trials, things to keep our eyes on. Next slide, please. So basically, there are some other early pipeline ARVs. Some are long acting, some are brand new classes, some are both long acting, and some are being studied as part of HIV cure strategies. There's an ultra long acting version of cabotegravir at 4 months, a version of cabotegravir to be injected in the thigh instead of the buttocks. This is because people who have implants in their buttocks can't inject Cab-LA there, and because people may be able to self-inject in their thigh and it may hurt less. There are different capsid inhibitors, which is the family that lenacapavir is part of. A long-acting oral version, and from Gilead and ViiV, both in phase 1. Other integrase inhibitors, a maturation inhibitor that interferes with HIV's ability to fully mature, and 2 long-acting NNRTI candidates and other immunomodulators. When I report on drugs or assess them, I don't bother to do it till after phase 2 because I like to use a lot of the criteria I discussed earlier in this presentation and really give people a full picture. So that's all there is on these drugs for now. Next slide, please. Okay, another thing that's being developed are broadly neutralizing antibodies that prevent HIV from entering cells. They also may be signaling the immune system to destroy cells that have already become infected with HIV. So these bNAbs are being studied to prevent and cure HIV and to sort of induce what's called treatment-free remission, where you can give someone an infusion of these and they would not need to be on ARVs. But they have a few limitations. The biggest one is pre-existing resistance. bNAbs target the HIV envelope, and that mutates rapidly, which means that they don't continue to work. So people currently need to be tested to see if the virus that they have is susceptible to a bNAb. And researchers are now looking at combinations of bNAbs to sort of avoid resistance. They're also studying them with ARVs and other agents just to see if they can hit on a combination that is more resistance proof. Ongoing trials will tell us more about the best bNAb combinations and the best ways to use them. And GSK and Gilead have bNAbs that are currently in phase 2. Next slide, please. Okay, so the limitations are that they're likely to be expensive, particularly at launch, because they're complicated to produce. They're biologic agents, which have a different and more complicated regulatory pathway than small molecules. They require a cold chain. And they're given as an infusion or an injection, so they need to be given in a clinic. And the susceptibility testing is expensive, not always available, and doesn't always work. So these are a potential future-looking option that we need to learn more about. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap this up with some updates on recently approved ARVs, mainly long-acting treatment with cabotegravir and rilpivirine and dolutegravir. Next slide, please. Okay, who is really eligible for the current long-acting HIV treatment? It's only approved for the population that it was studied in. So that is people who have a suppressed HIV viral load, no history of ARV treatment failure, and no evidence of HIV drug resistance. What this really means is it's a switch regimen. It's not for first line, it's not for second line, and it's not for third line treatment. Although in some cases, I think it's being used a little differently in the real world. This is who it was developed in and who it's approved for. Next slide, please. But there's been some recent research that's very interesting. And that's what I wanted to highlight. The CARES trial, which was a randomized trial of CAB-LA in Kenyan, South African, and Ugandan treatment programs. These were real-life settings where people did not get drug resistance testing before they started their HIV treatment, and they have viral load testing done every 6 months. And the people in this trial really reflected the epidemic. All of them were virally suppressed for 4 to 12 months and had no history of treatment failure. 99.6% of them were Black and 57.6% were female. Now, these things you see in red, the BMI over 30 or over, exposure to NNRTIs and subtype A, these are all risk factors for failure of long-acting treatment. So it's important to see that this trial really included people with risk factors for long-acting treatment failure. Next slide, please. So the trial will continue for 96 weeks. But what happened was people either stayed on their oral ARVs or they got switched to long-acting treatment. There were 256 study volunteers in each treatment arm. And more than 80% of study participants got their injections within the 7-day window. And as you can see, long-acting treatment worked just as well at 48 weeks as standard of care. So that's really reassuring because this was much more of a real life setting in a resource limited place where people don't get a lot of the pre-treatment testing that they would get in a high income country. Next slide, please. So the adverse events were mostly mild to moderate, consistent with everything else that's been reported. Injection site reactions, skin redness, swelling, and lumps under the skin. There were 3 serious drug-related AEs among people in the CAB-LA Ripivirine long-acting group, and 1 person discontinued due to an abscess at the injection site. It was not an infection, it was caused by inflammation. Next slide, please. So what about resistance? So although testing wasn't performed before people started treatment, trial took blood samples before people started treatment and looked at their HIV subtype and resistance after 48 weeks. And 10% of people had pre-treatment intermediate to high-level resistance to ripivirine, and 8.3% had pre-treatment intermediate to high-level cabotegravir resistance. And there were 2 virologic failures among people treated with CAB-LA, which means it worked for some of the people that did have pre-treatment resistance. Okay, 1 person had no pre-treatment resistance, but their treatment failed, and they wound up with resistance to both ripivirine and cabotegravir. The other person had resistance to ripivirine before treatment and had resistance to both after treatment. So that's the risk of this long-acting treatment, but as you can see, it's 2 out of over 250 people. So it does happen, but not at a high rate. Next slide, please. Okay, there's another trial I wanted to mention, and this got a lot of publicity after the retrovirus conference in February. It compared long-acting treatment to staying on oral Vs in people with what they called adherence challenges. So it means that the people in this trial either had a poor virologic response to ARVs or they'd been out of clinical care for more than 6 months. And before none of them had resistance to drugs in the same families as cabotegravir or ripivirine. Next slide, please. So for 24 weeks, everyone in the trial got standard of care oral treatment plus cash incentives to help them stay on treatment. Step 2, split people into 2 groups. They either got cab ripivirine injections every 4 weeks or standard of care ART. Now, I want to mention something. Usually, or long-acting treatment is every 2 months. I think in this trial, it was given twice as often because people faced challenges with adherence and they wanted to make sure to get the best possible response. So the trial was stopped early during step 2 because the treatment failure rate was so much higher among people who stayed on oral ARVs. So everyone just got switched to long-acting treatment. Next slide, please. So what happened? Treatment failure was described as 2 different things: stopping treatment or treatment that stopped working. So when you hear treatment failure, it's not just that the drugs didn't work, it's that people just stopped taking their drugs. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, can you go back? I'm sorry. I thought I had an extra slide in here. What basically happened was the treatment failure rate was almost 40% among people who got oral ARVs and almost 25% among people who got long-acting treatment. Now, the way Vive reported this was, it's great that long-acting treatment is so much better for people that face adherence challenges. Although that's true, the way I looked at it was, if someone is really having a hard time, just switching them to a long-acting treatment is not going to fix this problem, and they probably need more support and more services. So sometimes I think we have the tendency to come up with biomedical solutions that are supposed to solve more complicated social problems and don't always. That's just a personal caveat. Next slide, please. So we're still learning about long-acting treatment, and real-life studies are looking at people who weren't included in clinical trials, like people who have experienced treatment failure, people who are experiencing homelessness, and people who use drugs. Some of them rely on monthly rather than 2 monthly dosing, which means it will cost twice as much. Next slide, please. So the thing I like to think is the first of a type of drug that comes to market is usually not the best to market. There are more long-acting ARVs coming. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over this quickly because I really want to take questions. What we learned about dolutegravir is that people who had a viral load of over 1,000 copies while they were on treatment with either dolutegravir or efavirenz-based treatment, people who got dolutegravir were almost twice as likely to resuppress. So this led the researchers to say that people who have an episode of high viral load while on dolutegravir can remain on it if they get enhanced adherence counseling and support. They may not need to switch to a protease inhibitor. It also may not be necessary to double the dose of dolutegravir while people are on rifampicin containing TB treatment. And there's a lot of data now from Botswana, Eswatini, Italy, Kenya, Romania, Russia, South Africa, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK that says there is no increase in the risk for birth defects from dolutegravir use during pregnancy. Next slide, please. So we know that second-line treatment with dolutegravir and darunavir is more effective than dolutegravir with tenofovir and 3TC or FTC, or with darunavir plus 2 NNRTIs. Although other studies have shown that you can use dolutegravir for second-line treatment with recycled tenofovir from someone's original regimen. So the researchers have said there are some potential advantages to dolutegravir plus darunavir, such as being able to co-formulate them, and that you wouldn't really need resistance testing. As in other studies, weight gain was higher among people who got dolutegravir regimens than people who got regimens without dolutegravir. And more studies have found weight gain associated with dolutegravir versus efavirenz in people who are just starting treatment, with women gaining the most weight, likely partially because efavirenz tends to suppress weight gain. And additional studies have found more weight gain when switching from a protease inhibitor or efavirenz to dolutegravir in Thailand and Uganda. Next slide. There's some data coming out about the risk of hypertension with dolutegravir. And the good thing about this is it can be very easily picked up and treated. And that's sort of a flag for people to ask to have their blood pressure taken and for clinicians to remember to do it at clinical visits. And it looks like DTG increases the risk for a group of conditions like high blood pressure, high blood sugar, excess fat around the waist, and high levels of cholesterol or triglycerides. This is called metabolic syndrome. This is true especially among women, people over age 60, people who already have a pre-existing condition, and people who had HIV treatment experience before taking dolutegravir. Next slide, please. That's it. I want to thank all of you so much for listening. That was a long presentation. I really appreciate you hanging in there, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, etc.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It was a brilliant and really practical presentation as always. Thank you so much. I will now open the floor to questions. Maybe first there is a question or a comment in the chat, so I can read this while you gather your thoughts. So Simon Collins was saying, please could ITPC consider a title that makes the resource easy to Google? For example, what to fight for, when to fight, and how to fight for it would be a great subtitle. The current community resource is not very helpful given the amazing info it includes. I think it's a really good suggestion to add a subtitle, so noted. And then he said, just a comment, but lenacapavir for PrEP has such potential for people who don't want to take meds, all of whom were excluded by definition from the purpose studies, as these involved oral PrEP for oral placebos. We could have had much earlier and ethical efficacy data by using an injection placebo in people who don't want to take oral pills. Controversial suggestion, though, that didn't get used. I don't know if you want to respond.
I think it's a great point, and I also understand why it's controversial. It would be the best design, and you would have to say people didn't want to take PrEP, but it puts a trial sponsor in a really awkward position, because if someone got the placebo and they got HIV, it's not the kind of result you want to see when there is something available. Although if people refuse to take it, it's complicated. Very interesting comment. Thank you so much, Simon.
And next we have a comment or question by Leslie. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you so much, Tracy. That was an amazing presentation, and it's an amazing resource as well. My question is more just about, you know, where, especially now with the close of AIDS Map, or the upcoming close of AIDS Map, like where and how can we keep ourselves updated with this kind of information if, you know, ITPC doesn't put a great resource like this together? What would you recommend to us?
Well, I'm not saying this because Simon was part of this webinar, but HIV iBase is also a fantastic source. And there are other sources that do on-site reporting, but I would urge people, some of them are pharma funded and you can tell by their coverage. But community-based organizations like iBase who accept pharma funding do not allow it to dominate how they cover things. So I would say, you know, go right to iBase. If it's not an iBase, you can Google it and see who's offering what. If it's possible, I will do like a post IAS report and some treatment updates, but I'm not in a position where I can do those on the spot updates that some wonderful organizations have done.
Thank you. We have a question by Cuds. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Tracy, for this amazing presentation. I just have one question, please. When it comes to Kabbalah and the injectable PrEP, I mean, do you think that's in psychological way that people just trust injectable treatment? Because in North Africa, I mean, in Tunisia, in the pandemic of COVID, a lot of people just refused to take an injectable treatment, such as the vaccine of the COVID.
Well, it's funny because there are some cultures where people don't like treatment unless it is given by injection, and others where people don't want vaccines, don't like needles, or are nervous about injections. And I think it's a really important issue that involves community engagement and community education and information sharing, so that once these things become widely available, there are no barriers due to lack of information.
Thank you. Evgeny, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you and hello. Tracy, thanks a lot for your presentation, which is very much interesting. I have one technical question. When you describe different phases of trials, you mentioned head-to-head trials. Could you explain what does it mean? Thank you.
Sure, a head-to-head trial, sorry for not explaining it, is when you compare one product directly to another in the trial.
Mm-hmm.
So that you really get an idea, like, let's say you compared dolutegravir plus tenofovir plus FDC to bictegravir plus tenofovir and FDC. That trial has never happened because neither Gilead nor ViiV would like to see it happen, because neither one wants a trial where one person's drug doesn't look as good as the others.
Okay.
But
Thank
there
you.
are government-funded networks like the AIDS Clinical Trials Group that actually did some trials like that to look at, say, what was best for first line or what was best to switch people to. And since it's not commercial, they can do it if they have enough money.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Sergey, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tracy, for very interesting presentation. I have a question related first to adherence, because you mentioned that adherence played important role in results of lenacapavir trial and previously in cabotegravir PrEP trials compared to the oral PrEP. Because sometimes I was thinking, so is this the only reason why the results are so much better for lenacapavir and for cabotegravir, or these drugs have some additional kind of chemical activity that's potentially makes them better? And second question is related to, you mentioned that for lenacapavir, currently it's hard to speak about like introducing them in low and middle income countries as a treatment option because we need a partner for it. But let's imagine there is a partner in future, like partner drug, which will be also 6 months injection, quite strong. Would it be something really feasible? Because now the triple combination treatment is like a golden standard, right? The 3 components. Do you think it might be possible that like 2 drugs could be a standard of care in the future?
Wow, these are great questions. To start with your first one, we know how well oral PrEP can work from oral PrEP trials, right? So it's possible that there might be something that's a little bit better about something that's long acting, but you're actually comparing taking a pill every day to getting something that stays in your system for a couple of months. And that's why it's important to have studies where they, sub-studies where they draw a blood level to see if people are actually taking their oral PrEP. Right? Because that's how you can tell. If you look at the people who take it exactly as directed, then you can see if it works as well as the injectable. But if you look at everyone, you don't know when people actually took their oral PrEP. You can't quite make that out. So adherence does play a super, super important role. That much being said, since everybody struggles with adherence to a certain extent, it looks like long-acting things are more effective for that reason, not because they're inherently better. Okay, now that I answered that, your first question just disappeared completely. Just say 2 words about it and it will come back to my... Oh yeah,
lenacapavir.
feasibility of long-acting treatment in low and middle income countries with 2 drugs, right? That was it.
Yeah.
One issue is that in some countries, there's a very, very high prevalence of hepatitis B. So people need a drug that's active against that when they're co-infected with HIV and hepatitis B. And those drugs are tenofovir or tenofovir alafenamide. So they might still need to take that drug in a tablet form, but it's possible that double combination therapy with long-acting drugs might turn out to be really effective. We've seen a demonstration of that with cabotegravir and ripivirine. And granted, ripivirine's not a great drug. Cabotegravir is a better drug, but it was as effective as daily treatment in the registration trials. So I think it could work. And I think, you know, people are going to want it, and health systems need to figure out how to deliver it. All of us and others who work in access need to figure out how to get it affordably, and communities need to work together to educate people about it, including the issues that were mentioned earlier about people not trusting injectables. But I don't think it's going to be okay to say, oh, it's too complicated, or your health system isn't ready, or it's too expensive, and just tell millions of people you're not going to get this for a long time. So I think we all have a bunch of work to do.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Maybe I have a question on the timing of the interventions. You were mentioning the pros and cons of initiating, for example, positions earlier or later. I'm thinking if you initiate an action earlier and then the drug doesn't appear to be as effective as we thought, and the patent still gets rejected, it's still a good signal for access, even though you're not gonna. So I'm just wondering if you have a take on this, and maybe also other people on the call who are used to doing patent oppositions. Do you think it's more strategic to go for it earlier rather than later, or is it too much energy, and maybe it's a case by case?
Let's let the access experts answer that, not me, please.
Okay. Well, are there any other questions or comments? Okay, well, we are arriving at the end of our timing, so if there's no more questions, we can wrap it up. So the resource is already up online, so we'll share the link and the resource by email. We have the AIDS conference coming up, so that's also a good opportunity to get clinical updates and to be up to date on the latest information. So we hope to see many of you there. Just a point on the resource, if any of you have opportunities for translation of the resource, please don't hesitate also to reach out to us, and we can see how to make it happen. And yeah, so we'll also share the slides, of course. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for showing up, and thank you again to Tracy.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your time, and have a good rest of your day, evening. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.